I'm Andy, and I teach mythology and folklore. Welcome to Tantalizing Myths. This is the beginning of a series on fairy tales, and there's no better tale to start with than the one I torment my students with every semester, no matter what class it is: Red Riding Hood. Before I get into the actual story, it's important to note that fairy tales differ somewhat from our standard fare of mythology. I'll be creating a Myth U video about fairy tale features such as structure and details, but for now, just know that fairy tales are more generalized. They're not going to have as many story details as, say, the story of Prometheus and Pandora. Also, these stories are very widespread. What we refer to as fairy tales are folk tales spread across the European continent, and probably beyond, but the focus has been on Europe for the most part. Finally, we're starting to find collections of tales from outside of Europe and into Central and East Asia, and there have been standout Middle Eastern tales such as Sinbad and the 1001 Nights. Drop a comment as to which tales you'd like me to cover. Links and book titles appreciated. So, finally, to Red. Almost. Since there are many versions, we'll start with one of the more famous and older ones, the Charles Perrault version. Sorry, I can't trim my R's anymore. We start the story with a conundrum. How old is Red Riding Hood? She's introduced as a little country girl and referenced as the girl, the poor child, and the little girl, so we might imagine this is a child. In fact, the postscript moral at the end talks about children. Certainly, a lot of artwork for the time also portrays Red as a young girl, anywhere from 6 to 12, judging from a lot of the art. So, is that it? Case closed? No, not in my book. First, we do have to consider that postscript moral at the end as part of the story. Whether Perrault added it later during publishing or as his own flourish on the story, or if it was part of the story he collected, doesn't matter. It's there now, and we have to deal with it. In it is the caution: children, especially attractive, well-bred young ladies, and later on that wolves pursue young women at home and in the streets. Suddenly, our young girl has been aged up to a significant degree. But you might say that's technically outside the story. True. Let's look at some cultural linguistic evidence. As far as the language goes, well, the word means what the word means. But culturally, any unmarried woman could be called girl, child, little, young, maiden, etc. Womanhood was often tied to marriage, and the loss of maidenhood, which is relevant to this story, but that's for the future. Right now, we could go either way with Red's age. She could very well be a young child or a young woman in her teens. I guess we flip a coin. No, I wouldn't do that to you. There's still story evidence to consider. First, Red knows the way to Grandma's house. She even points it out to the wolf as being beyond that mill you see there at the first house in the village. This indicates that she has certainly been to Grandma's before, enough times to know the way on her own. Next is the fact that her mother is comfortable enough to send Red to go to her grandmother who lived in another village. Certainly, this is medieval times. We don't have roads and streetlights. Red's mom is sending her into the wilderness to another village. It would be one thing to go to a different house in the same village, but we have to assume that Red is mature enough to handle this trip on her own, despite whatever dangers may lurk. Red's mom evidently doesn't view this trip as too dangerous for Red. Otherwise, she would be going with her. Are these definitive of a specific age? No, but I think that's enough for us to confidently scale up Red's age to somewhere between 10 to 14, maybe as low as 8, and as high as 16. This will significantly change how we read the story from now on, as we start to ponder what the wolf is. Join me next time on Tantalizing Myths.